Dakota Territory, 12th of January, 1886. Iron hinges on a south-facing plank door contract overnight. Frost feathers along the pin barrels. The United States Army Signal Service summaries for the Northern Plains record 6 consecutive nights below -25°F, with wind sufficient to chill exposed iron well below air temperature. Most ranch doors use standard strap or barrel hinges, greased seasonally with animal fat. In summer, they turned freely. In winter, lubrication failed within days. Ledger entries from farms and ranches list repeated purchases of lard, lamp oil, axle grease, and hinge pins, yet complaints of crying doors persist through the decade. The failure was not a lack of grease. It was where grease could not stay once iron tightened and motion began. The Northern Plains endured winters that lasted 6 to 7 months. From November through April, settlements faced repeated stretches where the thermometer never rose above 0°F. These were not occasional cold snaps. They were baseline conditions. Ranch houses, barns, smokehouses, and cellars all depended on hand-forged wrought iron hinges. Blacksmiths fabricated these from stock iron, shaping strap hinges for lighter doors and barrel hinges for heavier ones. The tolerances were generous. A hinge pin might have 1/16 of an inch clearance in the knuckle, enough for smooth rotation in July, adequate for expansion and contraction across the seasons. But iron contracted predictably with cold. At -30°F, a 12-inch length of wrought iron lost approximately 0.03 of an inch. That measurement seemed trivial. It was not. A hinge pin with 1/16 inch summer clearance might have only 1/32 inch clearance at -30°. Friction increased exponentially. Signal Service temperature tables documented the phenomenon without naming it. The January 18-86 summary for Bismarck recorded 14 consecutive nights below -15°. Fort Buford logged 9 nights below -25°. These were not outliers. They were typical Northern Plains winters. The effect on hardware was mechanical and unavoidable. Tighter clearances meant increased friction at the pin-to-knuckle interface. Doors that swung freely in warm weather bound and squealed in cold. The problem was systemic, affecting every hinge in the territory. Most settlers assumed the solution was stronger hinges or better grease. Both assumptions were wrong. Heavier pins contracted just as much as lighter ones. More grease helped initially, but the cold defeated it within days. The real problem lived at the rotating interface itself, where metal touched metal and motion occurred. That was where lubrication failed first and where it needed to persist. A door that opened silently in summer screamed in winter. The sound carried across frozen ground. On still nights, a squealing hinge could be heard a quarter-mile away. Ranchers treated doors as neutral fixtures. They were barriers against wind, portals for movement, nothing more. Winter changed that calculation. A noisy door announced every exit and entry. Livestock checks required opening barn doors. Sickroom visits meant crossing thresholds. Checking on predators near the chicken coop demanded silence that hinges could not provide. Correspondence from the 1880s includes scattered references to the problem. One rancher wrote to a supplier requesting hinges that do not cry out at night. Another noted that every movement is heard by whatever listens. These were not poetic observations. They were practical complaints about a security problem. Predators learned human patterns. Coyotes and wolves understood that a squealing door meant human activity and opportunity. Thieves targeting isolated ranches used sound to map movement inside structures. Even between family members, constant noise disrupted rest. A crying door woke everyone when one person moved. The problem extended beyond annoyance. Ranch families checking livestock in blizzard conditions needed to move quickly and quietly. A door that required forcing created delay. Delay in -20° wind meant frostbite risk. In extreme weather, Every second mattered. Barn hinges faced identical physics, but different consequences. Horses startled at loud, sudden sounds. A screaming barn door in the middle of the night could spook animals into injuring themselves against stall walls. Smokehouses and cellars used hinges that failed just as predictably. Every structure with moving iron faced the same winter reality. Silence was not convenience. It was protection. It was efficiency. It was the difference between checking stock safely and announcing your presence to everything within earshot. But achieving silence required solving a problem that blacksmiths, suppliers, and settlers had been fighting for decades without success. The standard fixes all failed predictably. Settlers applied lard to hinges in November. By December, the hinges squealed. They applied tallow. It stiffened within hours. They tried lamp oil. It ran off and froze in streaks down the door planks. Agricultural manuals from the 1880s advised frequent oiling of all moving parts. The guidance assumed temperate conditions. It made no distinction between summer maintenance and winter reality. One manual suggested liberal application of grease to all hinges and fittings. It did not address what happened when grease became a waxy solid that could not move. Blacksmiths offered heavier pins. The logic seemed sound. Thicker metal would resist binding. But thermal contraction affected all iron equally. A 3/8-inch pin and a 1/2-inch pin both lost the same percentage of diameter. The heavier pin required more force to move, but it bound just as quickly once clearances tightened. Some blacksmiths peened the knuckles, slightly expanding the barrels to create more clearance. This worked temporarily. Within one season, the wear pattern shifted, and the hinges squealed again. The modification cost labor and materials, but provided no lasting solution. Store ledgers from the 1880s show repeated purchases of the same products. One ranch bought lard 4 times in a single winter for hinge maintenance. Another purchased lamp oil 6 times. The pattern held across dozens of surviving account books. Settlers were spending money and labor on temporary fixes that addressed symptoms without solving the underlying problem. The cost was not trivial. A blacksmith charged 50 cents to $1 for rehinging a door, depending on the work required. Multiply that across 4 to 6 doors per homestead, plus barns and outbuildings, and the annual maintenance cost became significant. For families operating on thin margins, it was money that could not be spared. Everyone treated hinges as a strength problem. Make the metal heavier, use more grease, force it to work. But hinges were not failing from weakness. They were failing because lubrication could not stay where motion occurred. The mechanics were precise. A hinge rotated at exactly one point, where the pin contacted the inside surface of the knuckle. Everywhere else was static. The door hung from the hinge hung from the frame. But rotation, the actual sliding of metal against metal, occurred in a space measured in thousandths of an inch. At positive temperatures, wrought iron's crystal structure remained stable. Tolerances designed for warm weather provided adequate clearance for smooth rotation. But below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, iron contracted measurably. The Signal Service documented air temperatures. Railroad maintenance bulletins documented the consequences. One bulletin from the Northern Pacific Railroad noted that fittings which operate freely in summer bind at temperatures below -10 degrees. The observation applied to door latches, coupling pins, and switch mechanisms. The railroad addressed the problem through frequent inspection and immediate maintenance. Homesteaders had no such system. The physics were unavoidable. Iron's coefficient of thermal expansion was approximately 6.5 millionths per degree Fahrenheit. A 12-inch hinge pin at 70 degrees Fahrenheit contracted by nearly 4/1000ths of an inch when temperature dropped to -30 degrees. That loss occurred evenly around the pin's circumference. If a pin started with 1/16 inch total clearance, 32 thousandths on each side, the cold reduced that to 14 thousandths on each side. Friction increased not linearly but exponentially as surfaces came into tighter contact. A hinge that required 5 pounds of force to move at 70 degrees might require 20 pounds at negative 30 degrees. Strength was not the issue. A stronger hinge pin simply meant more metal contracting at the same rate. Heavier knuckles provided more thermal mass which slowed the contraction slightly, but did not prevent it. The only way to eliminate binding was to increase clearance, but loose tolerances created wear and slop in warm weather. The problem seemed unsolvable. Summer required tight tolerances. Winter required loose ones. No single tolerance could serve both conditions. That meant either accepting squealing hinges in winter or accepting sloppy hinges in summer. Most settlers accepted the winter squeal as inevitable, but inevitability assumed the problem was in the metal. The actual problem was in the lubrication. Grease was present. That was not in question. Settlers applied lard, tallow, and oil liberally. They coated hinges until excess dripped onto the floor. Yet within days, sometimes within hours, the hinges squealed again. The mystery was simple once examined closely. Lubrication existed everywhere, except where it mattered. Oil streaked down door planks below the hinge. Tallow accumulated in corners where the hinge met the frame. Grease clung to the outside surfaces of the knuckle. But at the pin-to-knuckle interface, where rotation occurred, metal touched metal with minimal lubrication between them. The problem was not quantity, it was delivery. Applying grease to the exterior of a hinge did not guarantee the grease reached the interior contact surface. Gravity pulled oil downward. Surface tension held grease to flat surfaces. Neither force encouraged migration into the narrow gap between pin and knuckle. Store ledgers documented the futility. One mercantile in Bismarck sold 12 pounds of axle grease to a single customer between November and March. Another sold 16 pints of lamp oil to ranch accounts during the same period. The customers were not neglecting maintenance. They were fighting a losing battle against physics. Tallow provided the best initial results. Its thick consistency clung to surfaces longer than oil, but tallow solidified below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. At negative 10 degrees, it became a waxy mass that offered no lubrication. The solid fat simply sat on the hinge's exterior, useless. Lamp oil remained liquid at lower temperatures. It could reach negative 20 degrees before beginning to thicken, but oil had no adhesive properties. Applied to a hinge, it immediately began running downward under gravity. Within hours, most of the oil had migrated away from the rotating interface. What remained provided minimal lubrication. Axle grease, a mixture of tallow and mineral oil, offered a compromise. It remained semi-solid across a wider temperature range than pure tallow. It clung to surfaces better than pure oil. But it still could not redistribute itself. Once cold and static, grease stayed where it was first placed. If that placement was external to the rotation point, the grease provided no benefit. The cold did not remove grease. It immobilized it. That was the fundamental failure. Fiber held what iron shed. That principle was not new. It existed in tool maintenance practices that predated European settlement. Harness leather was kept supple with rendered fat. The fat was not simply rubbed onto the surface. Leather was soaked in warm tallow until the fibers absorbed as much fat as they could hold. The fiber structure acted as a reservoir. As the leather flexed, tiny amounts of fat released at stress points, maintaining suppleness across thousands of bending cycles. Rope used in gates and pulleys was treated similarly. Waxed twine could slide through stiff gloves on a cold morning. Untreated twine caught and abraded. The difference was not the wax coating the outside. It was the wax held within the fiber matrix. Each time the rope moved, microscopic amounts of wax migrated to the surface, reducing friction. Indigenous craftspeople had used fiber-based lubrication for generations. Bowstrings were treated with mixtures of fat and beeswax. The treatment was not applied heavily on the outside. It was worked into the fibers, then allowed to set. The result was a string that remained flexible and smooth across temperature extremes. Frontier tool practices adopted similar methods, often without acknowledging the source. Saw blades were stored with oiled rags wrapped around them. The oil in the rag's fibers prevented rust and provided a thin film of lubrication when the blade was unwrapped. Auger bits were kept in leather sheaths lined with greased wool. The wool held tallow close to the metal, preventing rust and keeping the cutting edges ready for use. The principle was consistent across applications. Fiber could hold lubricant in place and release it gradually where needed. Metal could not. Bare iron shed oil and allowed grease to migrate away. But fiber, whether leather, wool, cotton, or flax, trapped lubricant within its structure and released it through mechanical action. The question was whether this principle could be applied to a hinge. Could fiber be integrated into the hinge's structure in a way that delivered lubrication to the rotating interface without compromising the hinge's strength or function? The answer required reconsidering what a hinge was for and where motion actually occurred. The realization was structural. A hinge performed exactly one task. It allowed a door to rotate. Everything else, holding the door's weight, resisting wind pressure, surviving weather, was secondary to that single rotating function. Yet settlers maintained hinges as if every surface mattered equally. They greased the entire hinge assembly, coating knuckles, straps, and mounting surfaces. This was not wrong, but it was inefficient. Most of that grease sat on surfaces that never moved. The only surface that mattered was the one-dimensional line where pin touched knuckle interior. Mechanical guides from the 1880s emphasized bearing surfaces in industrial machinery. A railroad axle journal required lubrication only at the bearing surface where the axle contacted the bearing brass. Greasing the axle's exterior served no purpose. The same principle applied to steam engine crankshaft bearings, millwheel pivots, and every other rotating mechanism. The difference between industrial machinery and frontier hinges was maintenance system. Railroads employed oilers who applied lubrication to bearing surfaces multiple times per shift. Mills had oil reservoirs that fed bearings continuously, but homesteads had no such systems. A door hinge received attention once in autumn and was expected to function until spring. That expectation was unrealistic. Lubrication consumed by friction needed replacement. In machinery, replacement happened through continuous or frequent reapplication. On hinges, it had to happen through some form of reservoir and delivery system built into the hinge itself. The concept was not abstract. Felt washers were used in industrial applications to provide continuous lubrication to rotating shafts. The felt held oil and released it gradually as the shaft turned. Clock mechanisms used oil-saturated wool at pivot points to maintain lubrication for months without reapplication. Sewing machines employed similar methods. The question was adaptation. Could a felt washer survive between a hinge pin and knuckle? Could wool be integrated without creating excessive clearance? The challenge was dimensional. Industrial applications had space for lubrication systems. A hinge pin and knuckle had mere thousandths of an inch of clearance. Adding material to hold lubricant meant reducing clearance, which would increase friction. The solution required putting lubrication delivery inside the metal itself, not between the moving surfaces. That meant modifying the hinge in a way that created space for fiber without compromising strength or clearance. The modification required only tools already present on most homesteads. A drill, auger with a 3/16-inch bit, a hammer, a punch for marking, a small knife for cutting cordage. The work could be completed in under an hour. The decision point was straightforward: modify the existing hinge or replace it. Replacement required removing the door, transporting it to a blacksmith, paying for new hardware, reinstalling everything, and hoping the new hinge performed better than the old one. Modification required only time and a willingness to test a different approach. The risk was calculable. Drilling shallow pockets into the hinge knuckle could weaken the structure if done incorrectly. But a 3/16 inch hole drilled to 1/8 inch depth removed minimal material. The knuckle's wall thickness on most barrel hinges was approximately 3/8 inch. Removing 1/8 inch left 2/3 of the original thickness intact. Farm tool inventories from the period regularly listed augers in various sizes. A homestead needed them for fence post work, barn repairs, and general carpentry. The same tool that hung holes for door latches could drill shallow pockets in hinge knuckles. No specialized equipment was required. The timing mattered. Attempting the modification during a cold snap meant working with contracted metal and frozen grease. Better to wait for a moderately cold day, cold enough that the problem was evident, but not so cold that the work became dangerous. December and January offered few such days. Late November or early March provided better conditions. The economics were simple. A blacksmith charged between 50 cents and $1 to rehinge a door. Multiply that by 4 to 6 doors per homestead, plus barn doors and outbuildings, and the annual cost reached $5 to $10. For a household operating on a cash income of $200 to $400 per year, that represented 3% of annual earnings spent on hinge maintenance. Modifying a hinge cost only labor and the price of cordage, perhaps 10 cents for enough waxed twine to treat a dozen hinges. If the modification failed, the hinge could still be replaced later. If it succeeded, the savings in time and money would be immediate. The test would be simple. Could a modified hinge remain silent through a sustained cold period? Dakota Territory, January 1886. A ranch house door stood open in the afternoon sun. The temperature held near 15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but tolerable for outdoor work. A young man, role unrecorded, likely a rancher's son based on subsequent ledger references, removed one of the door's hinges and laid it on a workbench. The hinge was a standard barrel type, hand-forged from wrought iron. The knuckle measured approximately 1 1/2 inches in length, with an interior diameter of 7/16 inch to accommodate a 3/8 inch pin. The exterior of the knuckle showed heavy grease application from previous maintenance attempts. Working carefully, he marked evenly spaced points along the knuckle's length using a center punch and hammer. The spacing was approximately 3/8 to 1/2 inch between marks. 4 marks total for a 1 1/2 inch knuckle length. The spacing was not arbitrary. Too close together and the pockets would weaken the structure. Too far apart and coverage would be inadequate. Using the auger with a 3/16 inch bit, he drilled into each marked point. The depth was controlled by feel and visual check, approximately 1/8 inch, deep enough to create a pocket, but not so deep as to risk breakthrough to the interior bore. Fine iron shavings accumulated beneath the work. Each pocket was cleaned of shavings using a small wire. Then came the critical component, twine. He used flax cordage, approximately 1/16 inch in diameter, that had been soaked in warm tallow and allowed to cool. The tallow had saturated the fiber completely. When cool, the twine was pliable, but not dripping. Short segments of twine, approximately 1/4 inch long, were pressed into each drilled pocket. A small punch seated them firmly. The twine compressed into the pocket, filling it without protruding beyond the knuckle's exterior surface. 4 pockets, 4 pieces of twine. The modification was complete. The hinge was reassembled with its pin. Then the door was rehung. From the exterior, the modification was barely visible. Close examination showed small dark spots on the knuckle where the pockets had been drilled. Nothing more. The mechanism was elegantly simple. As the door moved, the rotating pin created shear forces against the knuckle. Those forces compressed the twine in the pockets. Compressed twine released tiny amounts of tallow onto the pin-to-knuckle interface. The fiber acted as both reservoir and pump. Motion itself drove the lubrication delivery. The test began immediately. January 1886 provided ideal conditions, ideal in the sense that they were brutally cold. The Signal Service recorded 6 consecutive nights below -25 degrees Fahrenheit at Fort Buford, with daytime highs remaining below zero. The modified hinge was on the main ranch house door, the most frequently used entrance. The door was opened and closed multiple times daily for routine tasks: livestock checks, trips to the woodpile, checking weather conditions, bringing in supplies. Each cycle tested the hinge. Within 24 hours, unmodified hinges on other doors were squealing. The sound was the familiar winter shriek that had plagued the homestead for years. The modified hinge remained silent. By the third day, the contrast was undeniable. Every door except one announced its opening. The modified door moved without sound. Not perfect silence. Leather gaskets at the door's edge still made soft contact noises. But the metal-on-metal screech was absent. The test continued through 2 weeks of sustained cold. Temperatures fluctuated between -15 and -30 degrees. Wind drove chill factors lower. The modified hinge received no additional maintenance, no regreasing, no adjustment, no attention of any kind. It simply worked. Comparison hinges, those left unmodified, required regreasing twice during the same period. Even with fresh grease, they returned to squealing within 2 days. The grease helped briefly, then failed as cold immobilized it. The cycle repeated exactly as it had for years. Visual inspection of the modified hinge after 2 weeks showed minimal change. The twine remained in the drilled pockets. A slight darkening of the pin's surface suggested tallow was present, but not in visible quantities. The mechanism was delivering lubrication invisibly, in microscopic amounts exactly where needed. Pin wear was measurable only over longer periods, but initial evidence suggested improvement. The pin's surface showed less abrasion than expected for 2 weeks of heavy use in extreme cold. Reduced friction meant reduced wear. The modification was not only preventing noise, but also extending hardware life. The test extended through February and into March. As temperatures moderated, the modified hinge's performance remained consistent. Even during the spring warm-up, when tolerances loosened and unmodified hinges finally stopped squealing, the modified hinge showed no excess play or slop. The shallow pockets and compressed twine had not compromised structural integrity. Cold that defeated grease could not defeat delivery. The principle was proven. The proof extended across years, not weeks. By 1890, the modified hinge had survived 4 complete winter cycles. The door itself required repairs. Planks warped, leather gaskets wore out. The latch mechanism needed replacement, but the hinge remained functional. This was improbable. Standard hinges in similar service typically required replacement or major rework within 2 to 3 years. Pins wore oval. Knuckles elongated from repetitive stress. The dimensional changes accumulated until friction became excessive even in warm weather. The modified hinge showed wear, but dramatically less than expected. The pin's diameter had decreased by perhaps 0.02 of an inch over 4 years. A standard pin might lose twice that in a single winter of squealing service. The knuckles bore showed slight polishing, but no significant erosion. The twine required refreshing only once per year. Each autumn, before the first sustained freeze, the door was removed and the old twine replaced. The work took less than 30 minutes, 4 pockets, 4 fresh pieces of tallow-soaked cordage. The annual refresh cost approximately 10 cents and prevented the need for emergency midwinter maintenance. A surviving ledger from an 1888 ranch account includes a remarkable entry. The handwriting suggests it was added by the ranch owner, noting in pencil beside a blacksmith charge from years earlier, "Boy fixed what 3 blacksmiths charged me for." The entry refers to hinge maintenance costs from previous winters compared to the negligible expense of the modified approach. The economic comparison was stark. Previous winters averaged $6 in hinge-related blacksmith work. Post-modification winters averaged less than 50 cents in maintenance supplies. Over 4 years, the savings approached $25, more than a month's wages for a ranch hand. But the value extended beyond economics. The silence itself had worth. The modified door could be opened at night without announcing movement to everyone within a quarter mile. Checking livestock during storms became quieter, faster, safer. The psychological relief of not constantly hearing squealing metal was impossible to quantify, but real nonetheless. Maintenance logic had defeated material brute force. The solution was not stronger hinges or more expensive grease. It was understanding where motion occurred, what lubrication required, and how to deliver it sustainably through the mechanism itself. The Grease-Bead Hinge, as it would later be informally called, had proven its worth across the harshest test available: multiple Dakota winters. The modification spread without publicity. There was no patent filing, no newspaper article, no agricultural bulletin. The method moved through the practical channels of frontier knowledge: direct observation, informal conversation, neighbor helping neighbor. By the early 1890s, the same pattern appeared on barn hinges, smokehouse doors, and cellar entries across the Dakota ranch belt. The modification was recognizable once you knew to look for it: shallow pockets along the hinge knuckle, often with faint dark staining from tallow. Each implementation showed slight variations in spacing, depth, or cordage type, but the principle remained consistent. Why did it spread? The answer was threefold: it was cheap, it was fast, and it worked. A rancher who spent $6 annually on hinge maintenance could adopt the method for less than $1 in initial labor and supplies. The modification took under an hour per hinge, and it eliminated a persistent, expensive problem. The informal diffusion meant no one claimed credit, no individual's name attached to the technique. Later references in maintenance notes simply described the practice. Drill small holes, pack with greased twine, refresh yearly. The tone was matter-of-fact, as if the method had always existed. This anonymity was typical of frontier innovation. The best solutions often left no paper trail because they were too simple to justify formal documentation. A blacksmith did not write down every small adaptation he made to standard designs. A rancher did not file papers describing a door hinge modification. The knowledge existed in practice, not in writing. The spread also revealed something about frontier technical culture. People were willing to modify hardware that was expensive and difficult to replace. This required confidence that the modification would not destroy the hinge, and confidence that if it failed, alternatives existed. The willingness to experiment with critical infrastructure reflected both desperation and capability. Not every hinge was modified. Some ranchers preferred traditional maintenance, regreasing frequently rather than drilling into iron. Others waited until hinges needed replacement anyway, then requested the modification from blacksmiths who had learned the technique. The adoption was gradual and selective, spreading through those most bothered by squealing doors or most pressed by maintenance costs. By 1900, industrial hardware was changing rapidly. Sealed ball-bearing hinges became available. Spring-loaded mechanisms appeared. The era of hand-forged wrought iron hinges was ending. The grease-bead modification faded, not because it failed, but because the hardware it addressed became obsolete. What survived in documentation was fragmentary. Most ranch account books from the 1880s were discarded or lost to fire, flood, and time. Agricultural bulletins from the period mention hinge maintenance, but offer no innovative solutions. Signal Service weather records confirm the cold, but say nothing about how people adapted hardware to it. One ledger line stands: "Boy fixed what 3 blacksmiths charged me for." The entry is undated within the year, but falls within 1888 accounts. The ranch is unidentified. The ledger was preserved as part of a county historical collection, but separated from other records. The boy is unnamed. Yet that single line confirms a quantified impact. 3 blacksmith charges for hinge work would total approximately $3 to $6, depending on the scope of repairs. The fix cost essentially nothing beyond labor and cordage. The comparison was not hyperbole. It was documented cost avoidance. The broader impact was invisible in records. How many nights of disrupted sleep were prevented? How many trips to blacksmiths avoided? How many dollars remained in household budgets for other necessities? These outcomes existed, but left no trace in ledgers, letters, or reports. The modification also reduced frontier dependence on specialized labor. Blacksmiths were essential for major fabrication and repairs, but every call to a smith cost time and money. A household that could maintain its own hardware through simple annual refreshment gained both economic and practical independence. Industrial hardware eventually eliminated the need for such adaptations. By the 1920s, hinges came with sealed bearings, hardened pins, and factory lubrication designed to last years without maintenance. The improvement was real, but it came with a cost. Maintenance literacy was lost. Frontier settlers understood why their hardware failed and how to fix it. Later generations simply replaced broken parts, without understanding the underlying mechanics. The Grease-Bead Hinge represented a moment when necessity and understanding converged. People facing a specific problem, doors that screamed in winter, developed a specific solution based on available materials and observable principles. The solution worked. It spread informally. It saved money and improved daily life for dozens or hundreds of households. Then it vanished into obsolescence, leaving almost no record. Frontier survival often turned on whether someone understood not just what failed, but where it failed first and how delivery could reach that place.